The history of the war in Afghanistan is something we all want to understand. We have to look at it from the past, then the present, and then we can have an idea of what the future holds for Afghanistan, if there is any at all. Stick with me for the next few minutes. In 2001, the United States Army invaded Afghanistan, and 20 years later the US is withdrawing, and the Taliban appears to be stronger than ever. They actually have control of up to 85% of the country. In 1879, the Soviet Union also invaded Afghanistan, and they also withdrew after 9 years, and the regime they fought so hard was back in business, almost causing the state to collapse. Before the Soviets, the British Empire also invaded Afghanistan on 3 separate occasions. For each instance, they failed miserably in conquering the nation. To this day, Afghanistan has a very small population, smaller than California. This is in a territory that is a little larger than France. How then was a nation this small able to conquer the militia from 3 powerful countries? The answer to that is pretty loaded. Let's, however, start with the most straightforward answer. Also the most obvious answer. Geography is a key factor. In the real sense, Afghanistan's borders were infiltrated by powerful foreigners more than a century ago, and its small population is comprised of 14 different linguistic groups and numerous tribes, many of which, such as the Uzbeks, Tajiks and Pashtuns, straddle the country's borders. Artificial boundaries set up by Westerners hundreds of years ago mean very little to them. The Pashtuns make up at least half of Afghanistan's population today, but 2/3 of them live in the neighbouring country of Pakistan, and while they are considered a minority, the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan runs through the Pashtuns' tribal area and hence divides the 60 million people between the 2 countries. This boundary was decided by the British Empire in 1893, and today not a single government in Afghanistan has ever ratified it. Imagine if in Europe Poland was divided between Germany and Russia, then a wall was built in the middle where the Poles live. Obviously the Poles would cross the border ignoring the dividing wall to see their relatives and friends. The Pashtuns do the very same to the existing border. The area surrounding is very rural and makes it very hard to do any patrolling. This has made it easier for Pashtun insurgents to infiltrate and operate in the area with little resistance. They're able to move between the 2 Pashtun areas in Afghanistan and Pakistan, regroup and recover from any attacks or capture. There are over 135 no-crossing points in the area between the 2 countries. The Pashtun are sympathetic to the Taliban and Afghan course and gangs. This, by default, makes this border one of the most dangerous in the world. As a result of this, by June 2021, Pakistan built a fence to that effect, avoiding border crossing. The crossing has been restricted to only 16 crossing points. This is just a start to what really makes Afghanistan impossible to conquer. When you look at the map, Afghanistan is landlocked, and for one to get access and supplies, you have to try to create a rapport with one of the 6 surrounding countries: Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, China and Pakistan. Even if you get past the borders of these countries and arrive at Afghanistan, you'll be met by the harsh terrain in the country. Even though Afghanistan is in the most populated continent in the world, the country has always been isolated, rural and underpopulated, mostly because of the high peaks of the Hindu Kush mountain ranges, where you'll find some of the highest mountains on the planet. 75% of the entire Afghanistan land is considered to be mountainous, and half the country has an elevation of 2,000 meters, which is pretty high if you ask me. These high mountains act as walls in more ways than one. They help to keep invaders out on one side and separate communities within on the other side. They, however, make transporting supplies across different areas a bit challenging. There are so many valleys that zigzag across Afghanistan. It's even difficult to travel from one mountain range to another. Over thousands of years, the different communities seem to go into their separate rural communities and individual tribes. In so doing, there's very little left of Afghan patriotism and nationalism. Any central government cannot stand a chance, since the communities in the valleys govern and rule themselves and would not have it any other way. Any semblance of Afghan national unity has been spearheaded mostly by the foreign powers who want to take over to a larger extent. Take, for example, the Soviets and, more recently, Americans. The ruler in the great city of Kabul may rule and show authority over the entire realm like the Roman emperor, but he's not really able to yield de facto authority over all the principalities, tribes and clans. Any invader coming into Afghanistan will also struggle with the same domestic issues that the rulership in the land has struggled with over the years. Afghanistan's geography is not really conducive to centralized authority. The same goes for the infrastructure. Enforcing your authority in Afghanistan means you have to figure out a way to move your troops across narrow mountain passes, which are prime areas where you risk being ambushed. These passes actually act as checkpoints for movement all across Afghanistan. Until the 1960s, there were actually no roads to speak of. Control over these mountain passes is control over an entire valley, and sabotaging one can block the supplies for days, weeks or even longer, depending on how severe the sabotage is. When the Soviets invaded the country, the Mujahideen defenders would attack Soviet convoys as they passed through these passes and flee back and hide in the caves when they were fired back upon. On some days, they were even successful enough to block full roads for months or even years. The town of Khost near the Pakistan border was sealed off from the entire country for the entire period of the war within the Mujahideen forces and sabotaged a series of strategic roads, and the only way the government forces could get supplies was by air. For the Americans, the same passes affected their movement, and the Khyber Pass here, which was the easiest path via the Hindu Kush between the Indian side and Central Asia, this path has been used for thousands of years by conquerors, traders, missionaries, all alike, and as the most strategic place to gain hold of in the entire planet. At one point, almost 80% of all NATO and US supplies that were being brought into Afghanistan passed through this point. This is quite ironic since most of the Taliban's weaponry and arms were also coming in through the same pass, probably through a different crossing point. The Taliban knew how critically important the Khyber Pass was, and especially to the Americans, so it was an important target for sabotage efforts. In 2009, the Taliban blew up a bridge, resulting in the shutting down of the entire pass. The Americans were then forced to broaden their supply lines to the 3 Asian countries bordering Afghanistan. In the years before the war, the Afghan government had tried to build a circular highway that had attempted to connect major economic centers together. Due to the never-ending civil wars, the highway was never completed. By the time the Americans invaded in 2001, only 50 kilometers of the roads had been paved. For a country bigger than France, this was underwhelming. In contrast, France has 1.1 million kilometers of paved roads. The lack of good roads made the mountain communities even more isolated from each other. It also made the transport of supplies a logistical nightmare for the US troops and the Soviets before them. Creating a road network in Afghanistan is especially hard because of the harsh mountainous terrain. The cold winter weather chews the existing roads up, and sabotages from the Taliban and other insurgents don't help either. Building and maintaining the roads needs a security workforce and then understanding of the ecosystem. In the end, it can be a very expensive affair. As much as $5 million per mile in a country an average person makes $500 a year. It's one of the poorest and least developed nations in the world. The construction of a single mile of road in Afghanistan is about the combined income of 9,800 Afghanis. Obviously, the funding has to come from abroad, making it easy to invade Afghanistan. The thing is, while it's easy to invade and take over Afghanistan, it is, however, very hard to hold on to it for long. The landscape is huge and creates opportunities for insurgents and the Taliban to hide effectively. Moving troops and supplies in between the mountains is usually hard and makes for easy targets for guerrilla warfare. On the other side, the relationship with neighboring Pakistan is complex in that Pashtun insurgents can cross over and regroup without much opposition. The flow of insurgent supplies, money and power across the border is difficult to stop across those mountain passes and requires the cooperation of Pakistan, which is never assured. The centralized rule is also hard to enforce outside Kabul. Nation building is quite impossible since the concept of an Afghan nation among various ethnicities is not something they see as a real variable. The colonial system in Afghanistan dictated by the British over a century ago is the biggest core reason for Afghanistan's stability. But Afghanistan has been very unstable even by the British colonial standards. For the past 43 years, Afghanistan has been in constant warfare, and it's quite a complex story to tell. It's a communist revolution state that enforces state atheism on one of the most conservative religious nations. Then came the invasion by the Soviet Union, then 3 civil wars, then invasion by the Americans and NATO, which is about to end after nearly 20 years. This is a violent and most controversial conflict of the 20th and 21st centuries. This just captures a fraction of the conflict and the way it has metamorphosized over the years. Feel free to share and comment and come back for more content.